One book can spark a scientific revolution, or it can stop one. It did both. For 400 years it froze the greatest minds of an era, sending them down the wrong road. This is not a figure of speech. It's one of the largest intellectual catastrophes in human history. A single ancient text, pulled from the dust of centuries, didn't act as a key. It became a lock. It didn't open the door to the past, It slammed it shut and left it locked for 400 years, turning the task of decoding Egyptian hieroglyphs into a maze of absurdity. We'll walk that maze. We'll see how brilliant people wasted lives chasing a false mystery. We'll witness an intellectual race between two empires ignited by a simple stone. And we'll stand in the room with the man who, on one specific day, September 14th, 1822, made a civilization that had been silent for 3,000 years speak again. This is the story of how the pharaohs' code was cracked. It all began in 1419. On the Greek island of Andros, amid a jumble of old parchments, an Italian traveler unearthed a treasure. A manuscript titled Hieroglyphica. Its author, a certain Horopalan, an Egyptian who lived in the 4th or 5th century CE. The find set Renaissance Europe alight. Here was a genuine ancient text, authored by someone from the culture itself, that claimed to unlock the secret meaning of hieroglyphs. The manuscript became an instant bestseller. Scholars copied and translated it, and they studied it under magnifying glasses in quiet libraries from Florence to Paris. Everyone accepted its central, fateful idea. The claim sounded simple and irresistible. Hieroglyphs were not letters, not sounds. They were pure symbols, allegories, philosophical puzzles crafted by wise priests to convey divine truths. Each sign stood for a whole concept. The picture didn't mark a sound, it marked an idea. Elegant, deep, and deadly. A belief that would poison European science for centuries. To see how deep this misconception runs, you only need one example. On Egyptian temple walls, you often find a reclining jackal. What did Horopalan say it meant? He insisted it wasn't merely an animal, and certainly not a primitive sound. The jackal, he wrote, meant judge. The logic sounds ironclad, because supposedly the jackal, unlike other animals, always stares straight ahead, never glancing to the side. Impartial, incorruptible, just like the perfect judge. It sounds poetic, weighty, and laughably wrong. In reality, the jackal is simply one way to record the consonants of the word Inpu, the Egyptian name for the god Anubis, the guide to the afterlife. It's part of the alphabet, not a philosophical treatise on the judicial system. European scholars hunched over manuscripts by candlelight, built elaborate theories, and searched for divine wisdom in what was, at heart, plain orthography. They hunted for hidden meaning in every stroke, while the Egyptians were simply spelling words. But why? Why did the brightest minds for centuries accept an idea that, to us, seems obviously absurd? To answer that, forget our world of skepticism for a moment. Step into an era when the ancients' authority commanded near religious reverence. People treated their texts like scripture. Imagine Leonardo da Vinci trying to learn human anatomy. No modern atlases, no MRIs. What would he do? He'd go to Rome and study antique statues of Apollo and Hercules for hours, days, weeks. To him, those sculptures weren't just art. They were scientific documents. He'd assume the Greeks and Romans had nailed the proportions, and his job would be to copy their wisdom. Renaissance scholars treated Horopalan's book the same way. It was the only ancient source on hieroglyphs. If Horopalan said the jackal meant judge, then that's what it meant. Questioning Horopalan would have seemed as unthinkable as questioning Aristotle or Plato. His book wasn't a theory unless it was the final word. One single idea, that hieroglyphs were a rebus, turned Egyptian writing into an impregnable fortress. For centuries, Europe's brightest thinkers beat their heads against that wall. They hunted for elaborate metaphors. They read cosmic analogies into ordinary marks. They searched for secret doctrines inside what, more often than not, simply read, Pharaoh Rameses, Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt. They tried to crack a code that never existed. Horopalan's great mistake turned the key to an entire civilization into an insoluble, divine riddle. And if the sharpest minds saw these signs not as language, but as direct messages from the gods, what fantastic worlds did they build while trying to decipher them? To Renaissance thinkers, Egypt was more than a country. It was a ghost, a dream, a cradle of lost wisdom. In Europe, on a moment where the air smelled of old parchment and burning wax, one idea hovered: the notion of an original theology. They believed that before Plato, before Moses, before any known prophet, one pure, uncorrupted knowledge of the divine had existed, and they were sure it lived in the Nile Valley, encoded in stone for anyone bold enough to unlock it. Romans had hauled Egyptian obelisks to Rome during the empire. Now those granite needles rose in city squares not as trophies, but as gateways to another world. Philosophers, cardinals, and princes stared at their carved birds, snakes, and eyes for hours. They didn't try to read them. They meditated on them, hoping the sacred wisdom would descend, like revelation. This thirst for mystery seeped into every corner, from papal libraries to the dim laboratories of alchemists. Hieroglyphs became their highest form of art, a sacred emblem of their craft. In books like The Runaway Atalanta, Egyptian motifs popped up next to dragons, devouring their tails, and kings dissolving in acid. The myth of Osiris, dismembered by his brother Set, then reassembled by Isis, stopped being just a story. For the alchemist, it read like an encoded recipe. The murder and dismemberment of Osiris became the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution of the prima materia in philosophical mercury. Isis's grief as she searched for his scattered parts became the long, painful work of purification, and the god's resurrection turned into the albedo, the creation of the white elixir, the precursor to the great work. They did not translate the hieroglyphs, they poured their deepest hopes into them, turning an ancient civilization into one vast alchemical treatise. Into a world saturated with symbols steps a figure of truly titanic proportion. A 17th century Jesuit monk, a polymath nicknamed the Master of 100 Arts, Athanasius Kircher. He wrote on geology, optics, and the theory of music. He built magic lanterns, early versions of the projector. He even climbed down into the crater of an active Vesuvius, simply because he was curious. Contemporaries called him the last man who knew everything, and of course he couldn't ignore the great mystery of his time. Kircher announced that he had cracked the code of the hieroglyphs. Scholars across Europe sent him sketches of inscriptions. Kircher shut himself in his Roman study and turned those sketches into translations that stunned his peers with their mystical depth and complexity. He became the unquestioned authority, a genius, a man who seemed poised to restore humanity's lost language of the gods. But his translations were pure fantasy, grand, poetic, and completely made up. He took a short inscription on an obelisk that today reads simply as the pharaoh's title, Autocrator, and turned it into this: creator of all vegetation and fruitfulness, Osiris, whose creative power was drawn from the heavens into his realm by the holy Mafta. That wasn't a translation, it was a mystical hymn born in his own head. And here the story takes a turn that turns Kircher's mistake into one of the great ironies in the history of science. The very same man gathered, organized, and quite literally rescued the Coptic language, the language of Egypt's Christian community. He produced the first Coptic grammar and dictionary in Europe. Coptic is nothing more than the last stage of ancient Egyptian, the language of the pharaohs written in Greek letters. Kircher held the key to every door. He knew how the words of ancient Egypt sounded. All he had to do was match those sounds to the hieroglyphs, and the pictures would have revealed themselves as letters. But he couldn't see it. The idea of a divine cipher blinded him. It's like finding a manual for an engine and, instead of reading it, kneeling before it, mistaking piston diagrams for sacred mandalas. Kircher held the Rosetta Stone a century and a half before anyone discovered its secret, and he used it as a prop for his own fantasies. 400 years. A lifetime wandering through a maze of symbols. Europe's brightest minds, from Renaissance philosophers to Enlightenment geniuses, found themselves powerless. A great civilization fell silent. It felt as if it would stay that way forever. But the answer didn't come from the hush of a monastery library. It was born in thunder, in dust, in blood. At the end of the 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte's army invaded Egypt, bringing not just cannons, but a whole contingent of engineers, artists, and scientists. For hundreds of years, Europe's best had wrestled with the mystery inside quiet libraries. The solution came from where no one expected: the battlefield. How did the roar of cannon and the clash of sabers become the key 400 years of scholarship couldn't find in their silent studies? July 1799, the Nile Delta. The heat melts lead. The air hangs thick with dust and gunpowder smoke, laced with a strange, spicy scent of foreign soil. Among the ruins of the ancient world, Napoleon's French army wages war. But this is more than conquest. It's an invasion of ideas. Soldiers, their uniforms blackened with soot and sweat, march alongside surveyors, botanists, and artists. They measure temples, sketch bas-reliefs, and catalog the local flora and fauna. Science has arrived in Egypt on bayonets, to take what neither mystics nor philosophers could coax out in their quiet studies. The answer to that great mystery isn't born from meditation. It comes from the clang of steel. In the small port town of Rosetta, just outside Alexandria, army engineers are strengthening an old Mamluk fort. The work drags on, monotonous and exhausting. Soldiers tear down crumbling walls to build fresh ones. Captain Pierre-François Bouchard watches the crew. At one point, a shovel hits something solid. Not a brick. Not an ordinary stone. A heavy, dark slab of granodiorite. One side smoothly polished and covered in rows of tiny incised marks. In the bustle of the construction site, under the blazing sun, that fragment could have been folded straight into a new foundation. Another anonymous stone, buried for centuries. But Bouchard spots something remarkable. The markings aren't uniform. They fall into 3 distinct blocks, 3 different scripts, and he recognizes the lowest at once. It's Greek. The realization didn't hit all at once. It rolled up like the distant rumble of a storm. Conservators wiped centuries of grime from the slab. It measured over 1 meter high and 75 centimeters across. Its black surface, scored with inscriptions, pulled your eye in. The top section, 14 lines, held the sacred hieroglyphs: birds, snakes, human figures. The middle, 32 lines, carried cursive signs, the Demotic script used in late Egypt. And the bottom, 54 lines, and it was written in ancient Greek, a language scholars in Paris and London could read with ease. This was more than an artifact. It was a translator, a coded message with its key, like finding a locked chest with a key carved into the lid. The Greek turned out to be a priestly decree honoring the young pharaoh, Ptolemy V, issued in 196 BC. If all 3 inscriptions recorded the same text, then for the first time in 1,500 years, scholars had an original, a reference point. A 400-year wall of speculation, built from the fanciful ideas of Horapollo and Kircher, suddenly trembled. News of the find tore through the academic world. Copies of the inscription went straight to Paris. The era's leading Orientalist, Sylvestre de Sacy, pored over them, and, like many before him, couldn't produce a full translation. But he made one brilliant observation. He noticed groups of hieroglyphs set inside oval frames that looked like knotted rope, what we now call cartouches. The logic was simple and decisive. An official proclamation praising a ruler would repeat that ruler's name again and again. So those ovals must mark something vital. Most likely royal names, and because the Ptolemies were a Greek dynasty, foreign rulers on an Egyptian throne, their names were probably written phonetically, not as pictorial symbols. Letter by letter. Sound by sound. For the first time, someone suggested a hieroglyph might not represent an idea at all, but a sound. De Sacy stood at the door. He never turned the key. He did, however, point straight to the keyhole. Then politics stepped in. In 1801, the French army in Egypt surrendered to combined British and Ottoman forces. Under the Treaty of Alexandria, all antiquities the French had collected went to the victors. The Rosetta Stone, the expedition's greatest find, became a war trophy. French scholars protested. They even threatened to dump the artifacts into the sea. But order stood. The British loaded the slab onto a frigate and shipped it to London, where it still sits today. Before handing it over, though, the French had made copies. Those rubbings and casts spread across Europe. The original sailed to London. Replicas ended up in rival hands. Suddenly, both empires held the same key. This was no longer just scholarly work. It became a race. An intellectual duel between Britain and France to claim the honor of being the nation that returned a dead civilization its voice. They found the key and copied it. The first crucial clue arrived. Royal names carved into the cartouches. The stakes had never been higher. The national honor of 2 great powers hung in the balance. One final barrier stood in their way. Getting past it required more than book learning. Who would get there first? The cool encyclopedic genius from England? or the obsessed young Frenchman who had devoted his whole life to this? Two men, two countries, one stone. On England's side stood Thomas Young, a man people called the last man who knew everything. And that wasn't an exaggeration. He demonstrated the wave nature of light. He mapped out astigmatism. He wrote encyclopedic articles on everything from mechanics to music. The Rosetta Stone wasn't his life's passion. It was simply another puzzle. He attacked it with the cool, clinical logic of a scientist. No sacred cows, only data and conclusions. France sent Jean-François Champollion. He was the exact opposite of Young. Not a generalist and a single-minded fanatic. The son of a poor bookseller, he carried one idea from childhood. At 11, when he first saw hieroglyphs, he vowed to read them. He spent his life preparing for that vow. He didn't just study languages, he absorbed them. By 17, he had mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Chaldean, and most importantly, Coptic, the last living echo of the language of the ancient pharaohs. For Champollion, this wasn't an academic puzzle, it was his destiny. A cool, all-encompassing mind against a narrow, burning obsession. The race had begun. Jung stepped in first. He brushed aside the mystical theories of Horapollon and Kircher as intellectual junk, and went to work like a cryptanalyst cracking an enemy code. He lined up the Demotic with the Greek, picked out recurring words, king, temple, gods, and mapped them to their likely equivalents in the Demotic cursive. It was slow, painstaking work. He pieced together a mosaic from thousands of tiny shards, often feeling his way in near darkness. Then he followed the key clue de Sacy had left behind, the cartouches. The oval frames everyone suspected contained royal names. Across the Greek text on the stone, the name Ptolemy kept turning up. Young found the matching cartouche in the hieroglyphic band and used plain deduction. If the name was written phonetically, the signs inside the oval had to stand for sounds. P, T, O, L, M, I, S. That little square was P. The semicircle was T. The loop with a curl was O. The crouching line was L, sign after sign. He tested the idea on other cartouches with Greek rulers' names. And it all lined up. For the first time in 1,500 years, someone did more than stare at hieroglyphs. He read them. It was only one word, the name of a foreign king. But the wall of silence that had stood for centuries developed its first fine crack. Right at the moment of his greatest triumph, Young made a fatal mistake. A mistake that stopped him just one step short of full victory. His logic, his main weapon, turned on him. He decided the phonetic principle was the exception, not the rule. When Egyptians ran into a foreign Greek name that meant nothing in their symbolic system, they had to write it down by sound, much like we spell foreign names today. But in his view, the real hieroglyphs, the names of native pharaohs, remained purely symbolic, ideographic. He had forged a golden cage for his own genius. He proved hieroglyphs could represent sounds and then insisted, phonetics only for outsiders. For their own names, the symbols would stay an eternal mystery. That discovery, and that mistake, became the race's final hurdle. Young didn't just find the key, he slid it into the lock and turned it a little. He opened the door just enough to peek through the crack, and in doing so he jammed the mechanism. One step remained. One last barrier, prove that the cartouches recorded not only the names of the Ptolemies and Roman emperors, but the Egyptians' own names, phonetically. The problem was this. Every known name in those cartouches turned out to be Greek. And even if they did uncover the name of a native pharaoh, how could anyone, after thousands of years, know how it actually sounded? Thomas Young stopped just short of the goal, his own logic trapping him like a cage. He proved hieroglyphs could be phonetic, but he quickly dismissed that as a trick meant for outsiders. For real Egyptians, he decided they were only symbols. A profound mystery. This is where Champollion played his secret card, something he'd spent his life building. Not broad genius, but a narrow, all-consuming obsession with one thing, the Coptic language. Coptic wasn't just one of the 15 languages Champollion knew. It was a ghost, an echo, the last living whisper of the pharaoh's tongue, written down in Greek letters. Where Young had to guess how a word sounded 3,000 years ago, Champollion heard it. He didn't guess. He knew. He knew the word for sun sounded like Ra, He knew the word for to give birth was pronounced mis. He held more than a key to the lock. He held the lock's instruction, written in an almost forgotten dialect of eternity. On September 14th, 1822, Paris. Champollion's study piled high with papers. Years of work, hundreds of dead ends, thousands of hours bent over copies and drawings by candlelight. He had already deciphered the name Ptolemy and even Cleopatra by comparing different cartouches and confirming some of Jung's phonetic values. But those were still Greek names, foreign intruders. Jung's framework still held like an iron cage. Then a bundle of fresh, precise sketches from the temple of Abu Simbel in Nubia landed on his desk, drawn by an architect friend. The cartouches had been carved 1,000 years before the Greeks arrived. They could not contain Ptolemies, only true native Egyptian pharaohs. The air in the room thickened. Everything he had been working toward since he was 11 hung on those sheets of paper. One cartouche pins his attention. He's never seen it before. Inside, 3 signs. The first is a circle, the sun. The second looks like 3 animal skins joined together. The third is 2 symbols that resemble the letter S. Champollion studies the first sign, sun. He knows the Coptic sound, Ra. He looks at the last 2 signs. The sound, Sahais S. He's already encountered it in the name Ptolemaios. That leaves the middle, unknown sign. The name reads Ra, unknown, SS. Then everything explodes into clarity. A flash lights up 1.5 millennia of darkness. He remembers references to this pharaoh in the works of ancient historians. The name is Ramses. Ra-Mes says. He knows that Mes in Coptic means to be born. Ra-Mes says, born of the god Ra. It all fits. This is not a symbol. It's not a riddle, it's a word. His hands trembling, he grabs another cartouche. The first sign, an ibis, the sacred bird of the god Thoth. The second, the same Mes sign. The third, a staff. The name reads Thoth-Mes, Thutmose. Born of the god Thoth. Jung's cage crumbles to dust. Phonetics aren't an oddity reserved for foreign names. They were at the heart of Egyptian writing from the very start. Champollion springs up. He bolts out of his study, runs down the street to his brother's office, hurls papers onto the table and cries, "I've got it!" Then he collapses, overcome by 5 days of nervous exhaustion. This wasn't just code breaking, it was a resurrection. The moment Champollion read the name Ramses, the impact rivaled the building of the pyramids. For 3,000 years, a civilization had kept silent. Now it spoke. Until that day, the temples of Karnak and Luxor had been massive, mute backdrops. Then their walls began to tell stories. They told of battles and rituals, of taxes and court cases, of love poems and medical treatments. Stelae, sarcophagi, or papyri, everything that had once looked like mysterious pictures became an endless library. Pharaohs ceased to be mere gold masks and wrapped mummies. They became people, with biographies, ambitions, fears, and triumphs. Champollion's discovery unleashed waves of celebration in France and fury in Britain. But none of that mattered. The wall of silence had shattered. Egyptian history stopped being a patchwork of guesses and became a precise science. Humanity had reclaimed 3,000 years of its own memory. So how did this script actually work? Champollion showed it wasn't one system at all, but 3 working together. First came phonetic signs. Some hieroglyphs stood for a single sound, like our letters. Others represented combinations of 2 or 3 sounds, like syllables. Those signs let scribes spell names and any word by sound. The second used ideograms, like the idea symbols Renaissance mystics dreamed of. A drawing of a foot could mean foot or to walk. But the real genius was the third part, the determinatives. These non-phonetic clue signs sat at the end of a word to pin down its meaning. After a word written phonetically, a scribe might add the hieroglyph of walking legs, signaling the word was about motion. A papyrus scroll signaled an abstract concept. No ambiguity. Sounds, images, and meaning keys woven into a single, flexible, remarkably expressive system. A millennium and a half of wandering in the dark, kicked off by one mistaken book, finally ended. The stone spoke, and it still speaks to us.